Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. We will begin with a brief round of introductions and introductory remarks while we're waiting for a few others to join the webinar. Like I said, welcome to the second webinar in our Skills in Action series on AI and the future of work, balancing opportunity and disruption. My name is Prerna Seth, and I'm a fellow at Just Jobs Network, a global think tank that focuses on employment and effective governance of labor markets. This webinar is a part of the FutureWORKS Collective, which is an interdisciplinary research consortium devoted to researching and understanding the future of work in the Global South. It was launched a year ago by the International Development Research Center of Canada, IDRC. And the collective is spread across Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Latin America and the Caribbean, with JJN serving as the coordinating hub for the entire consortium. As the world undergoes rapid technological advancement and human-induced climate change and energy transition, labor markets across the world are undergoing significant transformation. And we at the FutureWORKS Collective are committed to examining how these transformations and these changes are impacting workers, businesses, and economies at large, and how policy needs to shift to ensure that we can promote a path of inclusive and equitable sustainable development. So that's really what the goal of the FutureWORKS Collective is. That's what we are all working on and will be working on for the next few years together, along with all the organizations that are a part of this collective. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is the second webinar in our Skills in Action series. We had the first webinar at the end of 2024, in which we talked about, understanding labor markets across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and really understanding what are the shared challenges and where do they diverge and what are the differences between the labor markets in these different regions. We also talked about how skills development ecosystems need to evolve and better align with dynamic labor markets in the Global South, and the persistent mismatch that exists between skill supply and market demand, especially in response to transformations like technological advancement and energy transition and climate change. Today's webinar dives deep into understanding how AI is impacting labor markets, specifically in developing countries. We all know AI is evolving at a very rapid pace. And while there is a lot of speculation about the economic potential of AI technologies, there are very valid concerns about how the kind of disruptions that they are going to cause, the social and economic disruptions that AI is going to cause, especially across the developing world. And it is really essential for us as researchers, as well as policymakers, to understand how these technologies are likely to impact the economy and labor markets, and steer the development in an inclusive way to promote inclusion, to promote equity. So while there is the talk of potential to enhance innovation and enhance efficiency, and that has its place, those benefits really are limited to some sectors and certain types of workers. There are also fears of job displacement and skills becoming obsolete, and as a result, resulting in structural changes both within and across countries. Given, in light of all of these unknowns and questions, it is really important for us to understand how we can develop new policy frameworks that address the challenges that are posed by AI and AI deployment to promote economic equity, social stability, and how our education and skilling systems need to evolve, and how our employment policies need to transition to address the needs of a dynamic industry like AI and make sure that our labor markets can keep up with the pace of change. I'm delighted today to have three members from the FutureWORKS Collective with us to unpack these issues and help us think through how we need to design skilling ecosystems for the AI revolution. We have with us Stephanie Allais. Stephanie is the Research Chair for Skills Development and Professor of Education at the Center for Researching Education and Labor at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Her research focuses on the relationship between education and skills and the world of work. We also have with us Ramiro Albrieu. Ramiro is the lead at Futuro, an associate professor of macroeconomics and finance at the University of Buenos Aires. His research focuses on sustainable development, technological change, and workforce development in an emerging world. And next, we have Renjini Rajagopalan, my colleague at JJN. Renjini is the research lead at the Center for Gender Analysis. She is a lawyer by training and works at the intersection of gender, social welfare, and labor. Welcome to all of you, and very excited and looking forward to today's conversation. Before we start with the discussion, just a few housekeeping things. We'll have about 40 minutes of discussion with our speakers, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of audience Q&A. Please, a humble request to the audience, make sure your microphones are on mute for the course of the discussion. If you have any questions that come up during the discussion, feel free to share them in the chat box. And once the discussion is over, we will request you to unmute yourself and pose your question to the speaker, should you choose to do so. Great, thank you. Stephanie, I'd like to begin with you. Could you give us a quick overview of how the proliferation of AI is impacting labor markets and different groups of workers in Africa?
Thanks, Prerna. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I think that, yeah, the first thing that I would say is that we really don't know enough about how it's affecting people in Africa. A lot of the debate and the kind of what we hear in the media, a lot of the hype about the future of the work and the consequences for workers is focused on the North. So I think we really do need much more evidence and much more discussion and much more analysis of how these trends are impacting work and workers in the global South. So I think that's why our research collective is really important, and why it's great to have this conversation with Asia, Latin America, and Africa all in the room. Obviously, we don't know nothing. There is emerging scholarship. Thinking in particular about a book, I can put it in the chat, by some of our colleagues at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, called Recasting Workers' Power, Work and Inequality in the Shadow of the Digital Age. And the reason I like that title is because some of what we know is that many people in Africa, their work isn't actually directly affected, but they are indirectly affected in many ways. We are seeing some direct effects, and so I just want to run through 5 main areas where we do see people's work being affected, but then also how people are being indirectly affected by living in this shadow of the digital age. We see a lot, one thing that is quite prevalent in many African countries is platform work, and the gig economy, which is obviously sometimes said to provide flexible employment opportunities, but we know that it's really disguised employment in many cases, because the workers lack job security, benefits, and fair wages. And there's even platforms where freelance artisans are using. So that's one kind of way in which work is affected. Obviously, digital skills, digitalization creates opportunities for skilled workers and tech professionals, and there's a lot of emphasis there on education systems pumping out more tech workers. It's a huge emphasis in many countries. One of the issues here is that it can exacerbate inequalities, because we have huge digital divides in Africa for those without access to digital literacy or education. But even within elite jobs, I think one thing that I would really highlight here is that something that I think is starting to become prevalent, and I know that this is something in the global North as well, is as senior professionals start using AI, and arguing that AI is more efficient than junior professionals, I think we are actually undermining the training of a future generation of professional workers. So, kind of kneecapping the future elite workers. So that, that's something to think about, maybe when we return to thinking about education and skills. Obviously, there's a debate about automation and job displacement. And, that's one of the big debates in the global North. It is not as big in the global South, because most people are not employed in formal work in the global South to start with. But there is still potential for automation to displace workers in manufacturing, in agriculture, and in services. And again, one answer is often thought to be skills, which we can come back to. But, a lot of the research that we're doing in South Africa in particular, which is one of the most industrialized countries in Africa, we are finding companies that are automating, and the labor force is reducing, but not shrinking entirely. And actually, they're still employing many workers on production lines. And often these workers' work has improved and they are requiring higher skills levels. So I think that's an interesting thing to watch. Of course, we know that technology is not neutral, and I'll come back to that. Then I think another way in which work is being affected is digital financial inclusion and e-commerce. So mobile money platforms like M-Pesa can change work, but it can also have a lot of potential negative consequences like indebtedness, fraud, and positive consequences like reaching more markets. And then finally, I think something which will affect some workers in Africa, although perhaps less than in the global north, is algorithmic management. And, where algorithmic management is being used, I think we're almost seeing a return to, this is actually quite described in the book that I mentioned earlier, kind of Taylorism and the kind of really standardizing and routinizing of work. So those are some of the ways in which work is changing. But I want to just quickly, before I end, go back to this point about the shadow, working in the shadow of digital capitalism. Because I think that what's important is global value chains and relationships between countries and international labor markets. So yes, how work changes over the next 30 years will be shaped in part by technological change. But technological change is also embedded in social and occupational politics, global value chains, power relations between nations. And all of these will determine possibilities and constraints. So the direction of technological change should be a concern for policymakers. We should be engaging and lobbying with what kinds of technological change we're seeing. Technological change could be used to encourage and support innovation that actually increases employment and welfare of workers and the poor. But what we've seen in recent years is a global production regime based on heightened competition between workers, deregulated and highly financialized markets, commodification of previously non-capitalist sectors. And so, and new business models, we're now seeing, we might be witnessing the takeover of an entire nation. We're all watching that with interest. So, I think that all of that will actually affect what kinds of work people do and how economies develop indirectly, even if the content of work is not directly affected. I'll end there for now.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was very insightful, and completely agree with you that those that live in the shadow of digital capitalism are also very significantly impacted by these changes and transformations, and how it is really important for governments and policymakers to be thinking of the direction of technological change. So just picking off of that, and the earlier point you mentioned about even how technological change and AI is impacting the skilled workforce and automation and job displacement and skilling. How should governments in the region be thinking about these changes, and what can they do to help workers adapt to these to AI-induced disruptions? Specifically, I think it would be really good, given your background and experience, to hear about what kinds of education and skilling programs are being promoted, and to what extent do they meet the needs of a dynamic industry like artificial intelligence?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, Prerna, and I think there's different things that the governments can be doing, and there's different things that they are doing. One of the things that I would really emphasize is to be very cautious of fads. I think that the ed tech industry has been a very self-promotional industry for years. And what we have heard from it for years is how you know, this is the latest thing. Televisions are going to replace teachers. Computers are going to replace teachers. So the first thing that I would say is that there is going to be, and there's going to continue to be, an onslaught on education from the tech industry. And I think that when we are thinking about educational solutions, of course, technology can play a role, and there's many, you know, amazing platforms that can and should be harnessed. But I would say that we need to, if we're thinking about both in terms of how education is delivered and the content of education, education requires teachers. And the need for face-to-face contact is not just about lack of infrastructure, although that is really real in Africa. So, you know, the consequences during COVID were devastating. Education ground to a halt for most African children. There was no online learning. Yes, the proportion of people that have cell phones is increasing, obviously. But I would say that the first thing that I would say about education is steer away from quick fixes that you know assume that everything can be learned online and we no longer need formal education. That's not to say that companies may not need support from government if there's a particular piece of new technology. And obviously there are very specific skills that can be learned online in specific contexts. But in general, I would say that let's not get caught in those kinds of fads. And then I would also say that there's a lot of there's a lot of hype about, you know, for example, we've seen a lot of hype on 21st century skills. Which are, you know, said to be the skills that workers will need to be employable in the new 21st century workplace. And generally what we see in what the content of 21st century skills is usually either things that have been in education forever, like critical thinking, which is really not a new idea, or digital skills. Now, you know, obviously particularly in contexts where people don't have access to computers at home, it is important to teach people digital skills in education. But I think that we need that actually giving people substantive, well-rounded, well-grounded education programs is the best way that you can prepare them for a world of work that is rapidly changing. And if you're thinking about more direct education programs for occupational preparation, we have to be thinking about occupations in broader senses and not the specific ways that specific tasks are changing. You know, a lot of the work that has been done that looks at how jobs are changing and therefore it says this job will disappear and that job will disappear comes from work that was originally done on offshoring. And often what researchers do is they look at discrete tasks and they say, can this task be done by a computer or by an algorithm or by a robot? Yes, okay, then this task will no longer need people. But when those tasks are still embedded in an occupation, the occupation as a whole still requires people, and it requires people who have broad bodies of expertise, broad bodies of knowledge, and maybe some parts of the content of their work will change, maybe they won't. Because also just because something can be done by a machine or an algorithm doesn't mean that it will be. So I would really emphasize that when governments are thinking about responses, they should really be focusing on the basics, broad training, broad education, preparation that gives people, you know, maths, science, history, language. I think is what's going to enable people to actually be responsive. And then obviously in occupational preparation, the specific bodies of expertise that are required for different occupations. But I would not get caught up in trying to get education institutions to respond to every immediate change in the world of work, because they can't ever. And that has to be the job of on-the-job training at the end of the day.
Thank you. I think that's very insightful, and I think you're the point of moving away from very task-based or specific SAD-based skilling programs and initiatives is really important. Ramiro, I'd like to come to you now. What are you seeing in Latin America with respect to how AI is impacting the labor market? If you could shed some light in the context of work there, that would be helpful.
Well, first, thanks for the invitation. I think that I really like to engage in conversations in our collective, because I think that we all learn a lot, right? So let me talk about more generally about the future of work and AI, maybe reacting to Stephanie and your comments, Prerna, and then go into Latin America. And I want to talk about Latin America as an example of upper middle income challenges and opportunities around AI and jobs. Of course, we are Latin Americans, and each region has its own features, but I'm saying that it's kind of different from low income settings, right? Upper middle income settings. So but I want to give some general remarks on the topic, just to engage in the conversation, and then to go into Latin America as a benchmark, we can say, of upper middle income countries' challenges and opportunities around AI and jobs. So first, regarding the whole AI and work debate, I think that we need to try to reframe the discussion from impacts to creation, because the idea of AI impacting workers is in a way about AI being totally independent of workforce capabilities in our countries. And so as something that is coming from out there, and this is not, we are weak societies, or high-skilled workers are creating AI solutions every day. And with that, they are shaping technological change. So there's a close connection between capabilities and skills and the shape of AI trends and technological change. So I'm saying also to myself, right, because I'm always saying how AI is impacting as if it were something that is created from outer space, and just we need to manage. And maybe we need to reframe the discussion on which type of AI we are creating. Because in a second sense, also thinking about impacts on Global South, it has to do with, in a way, with technological transfer between the Global North and the Global South. We just need to manage what is being created in the Global North. That can be a second sense of this idea of impacts, right? As something exogenous. And I think that there we need to try to combat this idea, of just us being recipients of packages of technology, because again, it's kind of, okay, now we have ChatGPT, now we have DeepSeek. Of course, China is kind of an outlier in all this discussion about Global North, Global South, but in a way, for other countries in the Global South, it's kind of, okay, we need to do something with these technologies. Okay, maybe we don't, maybe we can create, maybe we can adapt, So maybe we are missing these discussions when we talk about just using the phrase AI is impacting jobs. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but I think that the way we speak about the world is the way we see the world as well. So maybe we need to try to reframe the discussion on that first. Second, I think that we need to work harder on unpacking AI, because we talk about AI as a monolithic technology, but maybe 10 years ago was something, 5 years ago it was something totally different. Now it's different, and maybe next year will be different. AI implementations and how this AI creates spaces of competition and complementarity with human knowledge or expertise. So I think that, for example, for me, of course, generative AI is really something huge, because in a way, I think that we are finding connections between syntax and semantics. And in a way, it means that we are hacking our very technology for communicating, that is language. So I think that this is huge, but maybe next year we will be talking about something new and we will say, no, now this technology, So I think that we need to do better in working with people from the technology side, to really start, unpacking and classifying, and understanding better different AI implementations. I think that we are not doing that the way I think that we need to do. So in a way, we're talking about AI, but it is digital technologies, it is automation technologies, it is, like 2015's kind of AI technologies, it is generative AI. Well, maybe I think that we need to do much better. It's harder because we need to talk with people from other spaces, knowledge spaces, but I think that we need to engage in these debates and in this cross, fertilization of knowledge soon. And this is my second point, unpacking AI. And the third one, and moving to Latin America, I think that, for example, regarding generative AI and Latin America, but also we have data, like global data on that. Of course, there's a lot that we don't know. I'm going to highlight Stephanie's comment on the lack of knowledge and data from the Global South perspective on that, because I'm going to talk about some data, but the truth is that we are navigating blind on AI employment, opportunities, challenges. That's a real outlook, I think. Given that, I think that we can say, for example, for generative AI, that we have a lot of workers that will be not affected directly, as Stephanie mentioned, but also I think that there's a group of elite workers that these new technologies are new ways of being part of a global value chain, right? So my main concern about AI is about wage inequality, because I know these people. We are even in a way part of this group of elite workers, right? Using new technologies, connecting to new markets. But imagine tech workers particularly. So I think that in a way, AI can be a source of detachment, further detachment of these elite workers from the local labor market, So I'm seeing these people, learning, using technologies, innovating, but in a way, this is also a new way, a new novel brain drain process. But now without migration, they just are there. They just are outside, regulations, connections with the local economy, taxation, and so on. So for me, the main issue around AI is about inequality in the sense of these elite workers, and in a second sense, that has to do, of course, with gender. When you see in Latin America these startups, we call multi-Latinas or tech Latinas, these big firms that are competing in the global economy from Latin America, you see men creating technologies. That's all you see. You can see some women in some, middle skill work in these firms, or you can see some women also trying to innovate. But again, it's about young men doing stuff. And I think that, again, we are with AI, at least in Latin America, we need more data on that, but we are in a way, there's a gender divide in the making, thanks to AI. Even in traditional sectors, you can compare the banking sector with the fintech sector. The banking sector has rules in Latin America about gender parity and so on. But in the fintech sector, where there's no rules, there's no good practices on gender parity, you see all men innovating. So maybe, maybe there's a cost of modernity in the status quo scenario. We are more modern, we are less equal in terms of gender. We are experiencing this type of trade-offs that I think that we need to address. And maybe we can say, maybe we don't need to be that modern. Maybe even modernity is not synonymous of a good show, you know. But particularly regarding gender, it is not for women, and we can show data on that. And finally, regarding this discussion around the working in the shadows and formality, informality, you know, our long-standing discussions about formality and formality in the Global South. I think that what is interesting to do more research in Latin America is about, again, the high-skilled elite workers that choose informality as a way to be outside regulations, outside their system. Also, I think that it is connected to this anti-state, anti-government, you know, movement as well. So I think that the whole IT value chain is working in the shadows, even in the global north. But part of this global value chain, in a way, is deciding to be outside regulations. It's not about, you know, a poor working conditions. Maybe it will be in the future for these people, I don't know, but not now. They say, I don't want to pay taxes. I don't want to, you know, pay taxes to this government. So I don't want to be regulated. I want to be in the global, in the digital field without any, you know, restriction at all. So I think that in this case, trying to make them visible is not only important for them, but it's also important for society as well, for getting more revenues, for having a more cohesive society, and so on. So again, trying to make these people more visible is important, I think, or their importance goes beyond skilling people. It's more about social cohesion, about, you know, taxpayer obligations, about you know, financing social policies, and so on. So I think that there we need to come up with a new agenda, maybe thinking about the, you know, new social pact with these elite workers, saying, I want you to be part of our society again. So let's just think about, you know, avenues for doing that. I think that are the main discussions, or should be the main discussions in Latin America. Well, maybe the should was too much. Sorry. And maybe in upper middle income countries as well.
I have a lot of follow-ups, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to restrict myself and maybe go back to one of the earlier points that you mentioned about the Global South being recipients of a lot of technological developments. And, you know, I connect that to, so there's a lot of research from multilateral organizations like the OECD or ILO that's talking about how higher income countries will experience or are likely to experience great impacts or great effects of AI-led automation because of their occupational distribution. So I'm curious, do you agree with that? What do you think of that in the context of, you know, the Global South, the Global North, Latin America, like you said, being an upper middle income region? Yeah, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, of course that the impacts are higher in the global north, basically because they are creating the technology for their own processes. So in a way, they are creating technologies for changing the labor market. So if you go to the global south, you see first that we have a mixture of different generations of technologies in our labor market, right? It's connected with Stephanie's comment on, you know, technological feasibility or the potential against the reality. You know, here we have people working with AI, but then we have people writing with the paper or just, doing, face-to-face interaction in the market. So in a way, first, I think that there's a mismatch between the technology design and our labor market that is common, because again, the technology has been designed for solving problems or creating value in the global north, not here, first. But second, that there are some complements that we don't have, such as infrastructure, such as skills, such as business model, such as, well, you name it. So I think that these two factors are important for thinking that we are not seeing these changes in the global north the way we are seeing in the global south, the way we are seeing in the global north, right? And finally, the third factor is about the role of digital services in our economic structure. It's more important in the global north than in the global south. If you look at countries where agriculture can be like 30, 40, 50% of employment, low skill agriculture, well, it's hard to think about one of these technologies that has been designed for 5G environments can be part of this production process in low skill agriculture. So I think that we will see more impacts in the global north, but I think that we need to do better in trying to think if these technologies can serve us for changing our labor market. And that's something that I think that we need to do, to do more research. We need more data. We need more discussions on that.
Okay. Stephanie, I noticed you nodding away as Ramiro was speaking. Is there anything that you would like to add to Ramiro's comments before we move on?
No, not at the moment. I just think the point about not taking technology as given. And I just think that we get so caught up in the way people talk about things that actually then ends up creating its own kind of logic, and we really need to break out of that. So I really like that point.
Thank you. I think, one of the biggest takeaways that I'm taking away from the discussion so far, which I think leads and ties in very well with my next question for Renjini, is how a big part of where the technology is created has a lot to do with how equitable it is. And so, Renjini, I would like to understand from you, given your extensive background in law and policy, what do you feel is the role that regulation can play to ensure that the benefits of AI are equitably distributed? And if there are any specific or examples that you've seen of effective policy design with respect to digital technology and labor markets, that would be worth highlighting. That would be, very insightful.
Sure, Prerna. Thank you for that question. I think there's a lot to unpack from what Stephanie and Ramiro have spoken about. And so, I'll try to respond to your question, maybe react to some of the very valid points that they've raised as well. I think the first thing that I would like to talk about is something that Stephanie mentioned, which is, the digital divide that exists in the global south. And so it bears reiterating because you have such a large swath of the population that's digitally illiterate. So when you talk about AI technologies, it's fairly outside their immediate reach and accessibility, right? That's the first point that I'd like to make. The second is, again, speaking to what Ramiro said about how, the tech does not appear out of nowhere. It's not given to us. But for some of us in the global south, it does feel like that because so much of the conversation and admittedly the development of this technology is happening in the global north, right? So it's important to keep that as a background context when we think about how we ought to be looking at AI regulations. Right now, and in some ways I'm generalizing, so I'm putting that as a caveat here. I would say when we see AI regulations, the two broad thrust areas that that I am seeing is essentially a focus on regulating the tech itself, right? Or the focus on regulating the ways in which we can innovate with that technology. Both of which are very important, but I feel like the focus ought to be something that we tend to miss is the labor preparedness that we ought to be focusing on, right? How do we ensure that we are proactively adapting our existing labor regulations to the challenges that AI and the changes that AI is going to bring? We all speak about the nature of work. We all speak about, the different technologies that are going to come in. And yes, there's a recognition that the employment models are going to change. But instead of just trying to create new regulations, how about understanding how your existing labor regulations are and strengthening them by keeping human-centered development as the cornerstone, right? So, what does that mean when we're looking at AI regulation? It means that see what are the areas or industries where there's going to be a flux from AI. So, how do you work towards ensuring labor protections for those workers? How do you break algorithmic, monopolies, particularly when you're in the global south? How do you ensure algorithmic transparency? How do you ensure collective bargaining, right, for workers that are going to be impacted? And I think when you're looking at proactively reinforcing your existing labor protections, using that as a foundation and building up on them, right? It should not just look at AI right now, as Ramiro rightly pointed out. Today it's AI, tomorrow it's going to be something else, because technology is so rapidly, evolving. And yes, it's difficult. And I can say this as a lawyer, it's difficult for regulations to sometimes keep pace. So it's important to proactively think about these things. Speaking to your point about, what are some good policies or regulatory systems that you could observe out there? I think there's quite a lot of good work happening in the European Union. There's the EU AI, Artificial Intelligence Act, that's recently garnered a lot of attention, which is looking at, AI protections from the lens of data protection, privacy, security, fundamental rights. A lot to learn from that. US is also, trying to see how they can make sure that there's a centering of human oversight, human governance, and thrust on worker rights when they're looking at AI laws. California there's a state level. So US is a little different from EU in the sense that there's independent, perhaps even slightly fragmented approach to AI. There's, there's the Colorado AI Act, which has been trying to understand what could be causes of algorithmic discrimination. They're trying to identify high-risk areas, of which employment is a key segment. So yes, there's a lot of good work that's happening. But again, like I said, it needs to constantly keep pace with technology. For those of in the global south, I would say it's an opportunity for us to learn from the global north, because much of AI regulation is still in its early stages, and we can work to collaboratively work to understand and create structures that can circumvent some of these harms that we already foresee happening to our labor market. Yeah.
Thank you, Renjini. And those examples were very helpful. And I think in a lot of these conversations, going back to, even if some of these examples are coming from the global north and not necessarily directly applicable to the south, studying them to understand how we can possibly think of more equitably distributed benefits of technology is helpful. I wanted to pose one more question to you, and this is more, this is broad, open-ended, and actually open to all the speakers. Ramiro talked about the gender aspect of AI deployment in the context of Latin America, but I think that's also very true for what we are seeing in Asia. I know in India specifically, how a lot of AI technology is widening the gender divide, and that that laid on top of the existing gender digital divide that already exists. So I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on what are some important measures to keep in mind, or what are some things that we can do to really counter that trend, or to attempt to counter that trend?
Sure, Prerna. I think that's a very valid point. And so thank you for raising that. And it's not just gender, right? I think all vulnerable communities are going to be, at the forefront of any sort of change when it comes to impact. And I spoke about the digital divide when I started out, speaking about the regulatory structure. So I feel like when you have these vulnerable communities that are already on the negative side or the back side of that digital divide, it's something like an AI technology is only going to widen that gap, right, when it comes to accessibility. So when you think about labor protections, regulatory labor protections, you're always going to see regulatory architecture that focuses on the technology itself. But that again, it brings me back to the point of why it's important to reinforce our existing labor protections, right? If you look at India right now, we don't have any single law on AI at the moment. What we have is an amalgamation of guidelines and frameworks, potential frameworks. And then on the other hand, you happen to have India's data protection laws, which are still in the process of being implemented. So even as you focus on on regulating and utilizing the benefits of futuristic technologies, you should really focus on ensuring that your existing architecture, protective architecture that supports human rights and social protections, whether that's your data protection laws or even your labor code. A lot of issues been highlighted with the labor code, but it's what we have at the moment. So you work to reinforce those social protections to make sure that the vulnerable, those that are vulnerable, such as women, minorities, etc., don't face the brunt of this, right? But I think the biggest takeaway would be that if you expect to do this in a piecemeal fashion, as and when every new technology crops up, if you expect a new law to somehow provide support and protection in the face of new technological change, I don't think that's the best way to go about it. I think you should reinforce and sort of be proactive with your existing labor technologies, ensure that there's a certain bare minimum human and social protection systems already in place, and then sort of build upon that as and when new technologies come. Just don't use every new technology as a hook to reinvent the wheel. Create a minimum floor, right, of social protection and human rights protection, and then just build on that. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yes, thank you. Stephanie, Ramiro, anything you guys would like to add? And also any last comments before we open the floor to questions?
I mean, I think that, the points that Renjini made about regulation were really interesting to me. I think one of the challenges in our context is enforcement. So I think, the one challenge is keeping up to date.
I think that we have lost Stephanie.
Yes,
Are you there,
I think
Steph?
so.
No. Okay, do you want me to?
Yes, please go ahead, and hopefully we'll have Stephanie back with us soon.
Yes, no, first, I think that we need to, or at least in my research, I need to enrich the view, trying to think also in terms of regulation. What I feel is that, of course, I'm going to say something obvious, that it's hard to regulate something that is moving, right, and changing. But I think that as the European example that you mentioned, in Latin America, we have been very active in trying to come up with new frameworks and now regulations for AI, discussing ethics, rights, social protection for digital workers, and so on. For example, in Brazil, now we have a new law on that is really something. In Chile also. In Costa Rica, it's more about promoting investments in AI, but anyway, so in a way we are, trying to reach a consensus on at least the ingredients, of this regulatory perimeter. But again, I think that us studying labor markets many times are not aware of these discussions on regulation. So I think that trying to learn more from each other. I also have to say that in many cases, when I look at, for example, the Brazilian regulation, I don't see a lot of analysis on labor, for example. So I think that maybe it's about trying to bring all the AI specialists, on the same table to think together. But I think that again, in Latin America, there's a lot of things going on around regulations and AI. So also we can learn from the North, but also we can learn from each other in a way, from peers as well. At least that's the Latin American case. And then, I don't know, I was reading the chat, but I don't know if Prerna, this is the moment, or maybe you can manage it.
For the question, we'll come to that.
Yeah, no.
We have Stephanie back with us, so I just want to hand it back to her for any last comments before we move to the question. Yeah. You were talking about enforcement, Stephanie, but you're fine.
We can move on. Sorry, I got booted out of the meeting, which just goes to show you that our technological infrastructure is really lacking a lot in Africa.
Okay, so we have one question from Susan Jobson. Susan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself?
Hi. I think I expressed it in the chat column.
Sure, okay.
I come from the education sector, and what I see in South Africa and Africa is that schooling is affected by teachers who are a couple of generations behind what's happening. And then, I mean, as we know, the quite often the learners are actually ahead of the teachers in terms of their understanding of technology. But we need to change. And how can we change schooling? I noted Stephanie's remark that schooling has always had critical thinking going for it, but well, it hasn't really. It hasn't in terms of the regulated classroom. The body, the education body is a very slow moving mechanism. And I wondered how we can shift that instead of, I mean, in the area of maths, for example, the kids are whizzing through questions. They don't know how they got to the answer, but they used a calculator for all those lines of working out that we used to have to do. But they don't understand where they got the answer. I've been teaching a group of students who say to me, they don't know where the answer came from, but they got it right because they put it into a calculator. And I'm talking about a grade 12 level where there's a couple of steps of method, but the formulas are in their calculators. That's a bit of a distraction from the argument, maybe, but I'm curious to know if anybody's sort of researched further on how schooling can change appropriately.
Oh, thank you for that, Stephanie.
Yeah, Sue, I think those are great points. You know, what I meant when I said critical thinking is not a new idea, I don't mean that schools achieve it. But what I mean is that, you know, if these ideas, education reformers have been talking about it for 120 years. So, you know, clearly it's not, clearly it's something that's difficult to achieve. And I think that, yeah, your example actually raises a whole range of different issues. I think, you know, your question made me think, when you ask how can we change schooling in the South to be more appropriate for an AI environment, I guess the $1 million question there is, what is more appropriate for that environment? Because, you know, maybe it's tech skills and maybe it's not. Maybe the AI is going to be really, really good at the tech skills and the gaming that the boys are doing. I mean, AI is already doing programming. So, you know, people who were like very highly sought after because they could do basic programming, that their jobs can now be done by AI. So, you know, a lot of the interpersonal stuff will never be done by an AI. Jobs that actually need human contact. So it is true that schools are inherently conservative institutions, but I think that in a way that's why we shouldn't. I think we can weaken them further by getting them to trying to keep up with things that they can't keep up with, rather than saying, what can they do as institutions in the world, in society, that can give something to young people? They can't give young people what a phone can do, or they can give people something different. So I just think that, yeah, that's really what I was trying to say, but they're good questions.
Thank you, Stephanie. Susan, 1 second. I think Ramiro also had some on your
Yes.
questions and comments. So
Yes,
Ramiro, over to you.
Very short. First, in Latin America, we have a lot of good examples about innovation, in the different stages of education. The problem is that it is hard to move these pilots, these local examples, to scale it to the, the education ecosystem. Governments are trying to do that, to understand better, to try to see if they can learn from these examples. Even in public institutions, you can see examples all over Latin America of innovative policies, model learning, many things. But the problem is how to change the system. And I think that, of course, teachers is an issue, but there's something deeper that is like you need a social reengineering, for these type of changes. And in order to do that, you need first money, funds. And in our countries, governments has no way of getting, even if they have the idea that, well, maybe they don't, but even in that case, you need money, you need society being involved in terms of paying taxes. And that comes for me to my first point today about these elite workers, because they say, they say, I don't want to finance this type of process of, rebuilding education. Well, so it's really hard to come up with a solution if we don't have strong governments. Of course, we need capable, we need smart government, we need political will, everything. But if we don't have money, I think that's a non-start. And I think that's a problem in Latin America. And finally, very short regarding gender. I agree with your comments, Susan. We are doing a lot of research on that, and maybe we need to start with gender literacy, in primary school, because all these gaps that we see in the labor market really started earlier and earlier in life, with this idea of, for example, boys are good at math and women at social sciences, these type of things that are happening maybe in primary school, and then it's just, continue and goes into the labor market. So maybe something about gender literacy, in basic education is something important to start changing this process.
Thank you, Ramiro. Susan, do you have a follow-up question or comment?
My follow-up is, I had this brilliant idea that if most of AI things are actually male, and that the male functioning of the world is being taken over by AI, well, then maybe the space we've got to create is for what women bring. What women bring is the connecting, the sharing, the understanding of emotions. Just a thought that's maybe, if people could only see it, that's where we should put our emphasis, and AI can get on with its male stuff. That was my yeah. Thank you for that.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, since we have no other questions right now, and I think it's been a few minutes, people have had the opportunity to post their questions. I just wanted to thank our three lovely panelists for this very insightful and interesting conversation. I think it's given us a lot to think about and a lot to unpack. And I would encourage everybody who's in the audience today to be on the lookout, because the FutureWORKS Collective will be doing a lot more work on these issues, and we will, have a lot more. We'll have more discussions like this, more webinar series, as well as more policy briefs and other outputs, unpacking a lot of the issues that we have discussed today in the future. So stay tuned, be on the lookout. And thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to Renjini, Ramiro, and Stephanie. As usual, it was lovely speaking with all of you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Prerna.
Bye.
Cheers, everyone.